Thanks everybody for being here today. We are going to be doing a Q&A with Parzival, aka Mike. He is the CEO of Magick. And if you have particular questions about projects you're working on or things of that sort, ask questions about what it is that you're building, what you're looking for help with, those kinds of things. And so I'm here standing in for Mr. Metaverse, who is out of the office right now. If you have things that you
Sure.
want to say and talk about, then go for it.
Once you get me talking, I will probably talk more. Somebody just launch in and ask me a question and we can start talking about something.
Earlier on the chat, Piglu had said, I'm mostly interested in accessing and using external data like APIs with Magic, so would love to hear about that kind of thing if it's on the agenda. And also any news or thoughts that we have on creating things like auto GPT style stuff with Magic. So actually that segues nicely into some things we've been talking about recently. So do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, sure. On the external data side, I think we have a general request node that in theory could make a request to any endpoint. The two things that I'm interested in is a lot of API integrations are actually relatively low hanging fruit. There's a specific service that you want to be able to talk to. We can probably make a note up for it pretty quickly. External requests are actually pretty easy. The other one that I'm looking into, and I know LangChain has demonstrated an integration with this, but any chat GPT plugin can actually is pretty much interoperable with any language model, just about. And so I've been tracking down chat GPT plugins that we could essentially add in. And the kind of cool thing about those is that you're taking the entire API spec for how to communicate with it and you're dumping it in, and the LLM can basically generate whatever queries it needs against it. So you're not even having to manually hard code anything. The LLM is actually doing the determining for the request based upon the actual API documentation, which is pretty cool. We might even be able to make a general node for that would let you drop in the API endpoints you'd want to talk to their parameters and have the LM come up with a query and send it off and get information back. So those are things that I have been, at least I have in my roadmap. If there's specific services, Piglu, that you're interested in, feel free to ping about them and we can set those up on a priority to look into those kinds of integrations. Other things like external databases, we should probably just have a database node that you input, you toss your credentials on. All credentials are being stored on the server side, encrypted, which is good, obviously. And each agent, so when you input secrets into a, they're only visible to you. So in theory, we'd be able to have the ability to access an external database. And again, another cool thing about LLMs is that they're actually very good at translating natural queries into SQL syntax within certain parameters. If you give it the tables and the general data structure and what you want it to be able to access, it will generate SQL queries. So that's something else on the roadmap. If that's something, if you have a priority, Piglet, between particular APIs, or if there's your own external database that you want to access, we can definitely get the team looking into those. We really should have, I mean, we have the alpha feedback channels for things. I want eventually some kind of a feature request that people can also upvote and add things into in a relatively easy way. I don't know if, does Discord forums, Ryan, support things like upvoting? I don't think they do, but
Yeah, there's ways to do it. And part of it is just it just takes setup and buy-in from the team and
yeah.
the group. But yeah, the Discord forums is at least currently the best way to leverage that. And essentially it gives you an opportunity to continue a conversation about a particular topic over time as opposed to
Mhm.
just one long stream of miscellaneous conversation. And so, yeah, if you have those kinds of feature requests or want to start a discussion around those things, like using the feedback forum, it's called Academy Forum on the team or on the sidebar. It's in your alpha channels. It's the feedback one. You should be able to create a new thread and we can just continue talking about those features that way.
Yeah, that sounds good. The other one, your very relevant comment about auto GPT type style stuff. This has been a big, obviously, topic of conversation everywhere, including internally. It actually made me and Moon pretty happy because initially we built Magic for doing essentially that kind of thing. I know Auto GPT has only been around for a little while, but when we first started architecting our agent server, the agent server is actually inside of a loop. It's a game server essentially that ticks every second, and we do have a loop plugin. There's a loop input. We need to flag it as experimental because you could rack up a lot of money very quickly if you decided to loop something against an actual LM. But the intention for it always was essentially what we termed looped agents, which is this process of self reflection. And we're not that we're pivoting as much as surfacing and prioritizing features that will allow for the creation and deployment of long running autonomous agents. There's obviously a very large suite of problems that goes into this, both in terms of trust and safety, productionization of these things, et cetera, and even just like general scalability. But I was actually just today, we're working on a demo of Baby AGI inside the Magick environment to be able to demonstrate the capacity, both Magick to do it, as well as for it to help us prototype out some of the features that you'd want in trying to develop these kinds of agents. The big ones for me as a developer that utilizes Magick is things like a log stream. So the ability to start the loop, is all these agents are essentially in some kind of a loop oriented system. And you want the ability to start a loop inside the IDE, stop the loop inside the IDE, pause it, step through it step by step. So just go to the next iteration. So you can actually see the chain of thought reasoning process that your LLM is taking, the tools that they're choosing to access step by step for the development of those kinds of things. Yes, I will chat to that in a second because that's something else that's on our roadmap. And the agent logging and the streaming. I've been working on a new architecture for our agents, which will essentially have every agent inside of its own pod or environment. So they will be sandboxed, they'll be independently scalable to high workloads. And we're working on essentially it's a task abstraction where there's going to be, rather than having you inside of a loop, there's just tasks and inputs receive tasks and outputs will queue up new tasks. And this will allow us to actually create both Baby AGI style agents, as well as a whole other suite of even multiple loops or multiple task processing agents or pieces of your agent. So that's the part I'm pretty stoked. I was just doing up the architecture diagrams today for how this is going to function, but it'll mean high throughput, high scale, autonomous task oriented agents, similar to Baby AGI, similar to Auto GPT. And in tandem with this kind of new architecture and these demos that we're working on, our design team is working on, we're calling it the Wizard Wizard. We've been thinking about this idea of calling agents deployed on the platform wizards. And there's the kind of configurator that will let you walk through and essentially say, okay, this is the agent that I want. These are the channels that I want to connect it to. These are the skills that I want it to have. Do I want it to be able to manage my project boards on GitHub or access my calendar and my schedule or act as a moderator on Discord? And then once you've set up your skills, you set up knowledge, and there could be pre-made knowledge packs that you can empower your agent with or upload your own documents or point it at Notion or Google Drive or other requested data sources, and then you deploy an agent from there. And we figured this configurator is actually probably going to get people started much, much faster. For many people's use cases, this might actually be all they want. They might not ever want to open up the IDE. Obviously, at the end of it, you can also open up your agent and see how it works. And the other portion that we're working on for community development is community made skills. So an entire Magick spell could be bundled up by a community member and shared to a marketplace of skills. So rather we were going to do this template thing where there's a bunch of templates for apps. But we realized that more so, I think what people want is this Auto GPT style. Choose a suite of skills that you want your agent to have, and then task it with doing things for you, whether that be on an interval or semi-autonomously, where it checks in with you once in a while when it's doing stuff. But that's very much where the future of Magick is going, is making these kinds of agents easy to build, easy to maintain, and easy to scale and deploy, and then deal with obviously the trust and safety issues that come along with building and utilizing these agents both in production and obviously for companies. So yeah, hopefully my hope is to have a demo of a Baby AGI running inside of Magick in the next week or so to demonstrate the capabilities, and then from there to start adding on some of these nice features. Same with like agents, as people have probably been aware, are not the best user experience. Having visibility into your agent's logs, knowing when they're actually online versus when they're not. There's a lot of user experience features that we're going to be adding on top of agents for visibility into their runtime and what they're processing and how they're functioning. So that's all on our roadmap. And to say the give bots budgets, we're thinking about some kind of a cap system. So we are also working currently our payment system, which is essentially, I don't know how many people we've mentioned this to, but the idea is either you'll be able to put in your own OpenAI key, or we'll be handling all the payments under the hood or a fractional cost on top of it. And we'll be integrating OpenAI obviously AI 21, Cohere, custom models out on Banana, and you'll just have to go through one payment system through our platform if that's what you choose. So you don't have to worry about all of the headaches of managing API keys for all of these kinds of services. And along with that payment thing, we're looking at those strategies of giving bots budgets, being able to say you can spend this amount of money per month, or setting various kinds of caps for yourself or rate limits. You might actually just want to artificially slow down your bots in order to keep them running but save some money. So all those will also be options for people moving forward as we flesh out what payment looks like and then thus money management. Yeah, MetaRick. Does that answer your question, Piglet? Any follow-ups before I move on from the topic? Okay, cool. But yeah, MetaRick X, more conceptual. What's your future vision front end for Magic? When you dream about communicating daily, how does your front end look? VR, mobile, IRL, robots, all that kind of front end. So for some history on Magic, when I left Latitude where I was before, I was my personal passion is in augmented reality games, otherwise sometimes called distributed narratives. And what I wanted to build was an AI powered ARG engine. At the time, I had the early precursor to Magic, which I had called Thoth, which was open source while I was at Latitude. And I was building on top of that. And to give you an idea about what my ideal front end looks like, all of them. I believe in this idea that the ideal agent has what's sometimes termed network consciousness. It doesn't just exist on one platform. It, in fact, exists as a distributed consciousness across all of the places that it's plugged into. And the ability to have these agents, not just one agent, but multiple agents participating together in theory in a shared world. And this is the difference between, say, business use cases where your shared world is business objectives for your company versus the immersive game use case where the agents are participating in a world state that's entirely fictional and been created. But that's my ideal front end is actually the utilization of these agents to play out long form ongoing stories and narratives. Getting them into robots would be really cool. I would not argue with getting to see some robots. I actually saw there was somebody did a hackathon where they connected Chat GPT to a Furby. I think this is totally wild. We do have another developer in the community who's been working on integrating it in with, are they called Magic? I think they're called Magic Mirrors. Moon's been responsible for a lot of this, but basically the 3D holographic displays, where ideally you'd have a little picture frame, your avatar agent sitting on your desk, and they just be your helper assistant throughout the day. I really like that kind of ideal vision. Augmented reality too, super into the idea of just having your agent following you around. I think this is the ability for your agent to follow you along platforms. Like when you leave the house and you're not bringing your picture frame, having them know that you left the house and they pop over onto your phone and now they're with you on your phone and you sit down at your computer and now they move from the computer from your phone over onto your computer with you. I think this idea of network consciousness and multimodality means that they'll be able to shift themselves around to best meet your convenience, or you'll hop into a 3D world and their avatar pops in beside you and is now following you around. That's where I see, as you say, the front end for how these agents are being interacted with. Oh, Webiverse stuff. Yeah. So we don't have a lot of them yet. Our kind of part of our partnership pipeline and strategy is what we term, we have integration partners, collaboration partners, people that we're working with on interesting collaborations, and then infrastructure partners to help to reduce costs for us and our community from providers. And we haven't done a lot on the integration side, but we always pictured that we find, say, Hyperfi. I know there's a lot of people in the community close to people at Hyperfi or Webiverse, obviously, who are interested in exposing more aspects of their platform for Magic developers to be able to use. So as you say, the ability to like summon an NPC to follow you, there's a whole problem space, which is a very interesting problem space of giving these agents access to 2D and 3D world states. People have probably seen the recent generative agents paper that got published, but essentially they made these autonomous agents. They gave them tasks, they gave them short and long-term memory, and they put them into a little like Stardew Valley pixel world, and then they simulated it for, I don't know, it was a day or something like that. And all these crazy emergent properties happened where the characters started forming relationships, and one of them was tasked with starting a Valentine's Day party. So she started planning her party and she went around to all the people and invited everybody that she met to her party. And people that she invited to her party started going around inviting their friends to the party. The whole thing was this kind of just completely emergent from the nature of these reasoning language model powered agents inside of a game world. And this was something that actually, when I first met Moon, when he was working on the XR engine, he was really into this. Hey, we could take the 3D world. And if we turn everything into text descriptions, we can have the agent interact with the text world and then turn that back into actions inside of the world. And this has always been super exciting for me. That's when I first met Moon, I was like, oh my God, yes, we need that. The ability to take these agents and give them contextual awareness of a game world, but translated into language. Essentially, how this generative paper worked is that the game engine could render for any one of the agents inside the world, take the world state and turn it into a text description. So now your agent's actually just interacting inside of a text world, and then you're parsing it back out into a 2D or a 3D world. And I think that level, that's the kind of integration that I would love we have on our roadmap. And I have, at least for our general vision, of finding an integration partner like Hyper5 would be awesome, for example, who's willing to help us expose that kind of information to Magic developers and Magic agents. So you'd have the ability to actually hook into parts of the platform's core action sequence, trigger animations, trigger the ability for an NPC to follow you or to execute tasks inside of the world. That, again, that definitely excites me because that was a lot of what I was looking at when I was working at Latitude. And does that answer your question, Meterick? Cool. Yeah.
Awesome.
Anybody? Yeah. Go ahead, Ryan.
Mike, I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about what it was that helped bring the team together in the first place? Like, what is it about? Like, what's the origin story of how you all connected?
Let me see. That's the company itself. I know our behind Magic, the company that we founded, it started off, it was me and Dragon, who's currently in the audience. Good friend of mine of 15 years now, probably. Oh, there we go. We got Dragon on here.
Hello.
Yo. And I had been working at Latitude. I was doing kind of technical direction of R&D on our new games and experiences. And we were prototyping out games. We were taking the GPT-3. This was 2 years ago now. And we started trying to make new kinds of games with them where we were utilizing the few shot capabilities to make different kinds of natural language few shots, parsing text in different ways. We're trying to see if we could make like an AI dungeon master, constrain the world. You know, how many people have played AI dungeon? It's just this free form. You can do whatever you want. We're like, games are fun because they have constraints. So we started trying to constrain it. We started chaining together these prompts, and we just did the whole thing in just this mess of code, and it was a nightmare. I started building out a little module system from there, and eventually that got too complicated. I started making these flow diagrams, and I was like, man, I can I'd make a flow diagram and then start to execute it in code. And I was like, man, imagine if I just had an application where I could just make my flow diagrams and run them. And that gave me the idea of like visually chaining these things together. And so as my time at Latitude was wrapping up, and I had connected with Shaw while I was still there with Moon, I don't think we're gonna need Neuralink. I'll talk about that after. But and I met Shaw and he was working on the XR engine, working on these agents. And I was trying to figure out how to get LLMs into games. That was what I was tasked with at my job. And that connected me and Moon. Moon was trying to do this stuff manually too. And he saw the early version of Magick, which I had called Thoth. He saw that and was just like, I need this. Like, I need this right now. Because he was facing the same problem as me, which was ballooning complexity of making these multi-dependent chains of few shots and asynchronous calls and everything. So we open sourced it at Latitude. Moon picked it up and started running with it. After I left Latitude, I was like, okay, I'm going to try to keep going and doing what I was doing while I was at Latitude. And I was like, I'm going to start a company. How hard can it be to start a company? I was kind of like, I set myself to things and I'm hard headed when it comes to, I'm like, no, I'm going to do it. And I put together a deck at the time. I actually started pitching this idea. I was calling it Argos, the alternate reality game operating system, which was to build AI powered distributed narratives. We put together a whole roadmap of kind of this game that we wanted to make called Meta Village, where we'd help to train these agents and embed them inside story worlds. And I just went out and started pitching to VCs. I had no idea what I was doing. And it was definitely a hard-in learning process. We went through a number of early co-founders who didn't either want to take on the risk or were actually pretty happy at their job or turned out they weren't entrepreneurs, all of whom spun off and are still in good contact. And then at the end of all of this, and I was like, okay, My idea for building a generative AI game engine didn't pan out, but I had this tool that I was using to build my game engine, this prompt chaining tool. And when I started pitching, people were like, "Prompt chaining, what's that?" Or "Why would people ever need that?" Because ChatGPT wasn't a thing at that point. Obviously, ChatGPT landed and the game just changed. Everybody knew what LLMs were. They knew the power of language models and the convenience of them. LangChain started rising in its popularity, showing the ability of chaining prompts together and connecting them to external services. All these, now we have Auto GPT is this next wave of this paradigm. And all of a sudden, I was like, hey, I have this tool that I've been using myself to build stuff with, and we had it open sourced. And Moon had been over at Webiverse for a while, and he came back around to the fold and started hacking on Thoth again with me. And we he started building a bunch of cool integrations. We got Discord voice. He brought it on to the M3 community, and people started playing around with it there. And all of a sudden, all these people were like, "How can I use this?" And wanting to trying to install it locally, and trying to. When people started asking us, "Hey, can you guys put it up in the cloud?" And we're like, "Okay, maybe we should try doing this as a business. Maybe this is actually something that other people want." And that was really like it came out of solving a personal problem for ourselves of trying to work with and scale these kinds of systems with LLMs and other AI models now that can be hooked up into it. So the paradigm shifted, and that's when at the same time Shaw came on. We finalized the company. We rebranded to Magick, and we got some angel funding came in. Our wonderful now business partner Matt, and we really started grinding the gears at that point. And that's around the same time when Mr. Metaverse Jesse was like, he's been my advisor basically from the beginning. As soon as I decided I wanted to start a company, Moon was like, "You got to talk to my buddy Jesse." And instant connection. We became not only great friends, he became an advisor for me. I meet with him every week. I've been meeting with him every week for about a year. And when the opportunity came to hop on board and join the team, he was just like, yes. It was great. It was very fortuitous. And so at that point, it was like we had me and and Dragon was he hopped on board within the first couple months, and I decided I wanted to start a company. He's just been a solid backbone since then. And I had some people come in wanting to be founders, then they left, or all these founders' dilemmas that come up in trying to start a company. And Dragon was just always there. And so then when Moon jumped on, and then Jesse, we actually had a solid team. And we had some money in, and we started grinding, and we started trying to formulate our, what the strategy is. So astounds that it's only been two-ish months. We only really got our first angel investment in like beginning of February, basically, which is crazy to think about. We've been growing the team to really support the technology and to drive it in this direction that we want it to go. The one piece that I don't think we've been that public about, but part of what we want to do, we're working on Eliza right now. Some people know Eliza was the first demo of Magick on the Metaverse Makers community. And our goal with Eliza is that she's going to be able to help everybody with everything. She's going to know our documentation. She's going to be here on Discord, helping to moderate. You're going to be able to ask her questions about Magick itself. She'll be able to have context for our feature request board and the current state of development. She'll be in the environment with you, able to answer questions for you about how anything inside the environment works. I've been playing around with taking Magick. When you build an application of Magick, you get this giant blob out, this big data blob. That's basically what a spell is. A spell is just a big data blob configuration. I took it and I dumped it into GPT-4 and I started asking it questions about my spell. And it knew what connected to what. It gave me a general idea about what the spell did. It could redraw like UML system diagrams from the JSON blob that was exported. Like it already knew a whole bunch of stuff about it. We were like, man, if we just put Eliza in the environment and give her access to the current state of the spell, she'd already, without having to do anything, be of immense value and help to anybody building with it. Then we really have this idea of code generation, not at a code level, but actually up at a node-based programming level where she can actually recommend next nodes for you based upon what you want your spell to do, the ability to go from text to spell where she can actually kick you off with a whole spell generated. I know. Yeah. So this is like part of our reformulation of our team, and some of the expansion of our team has been realizing that we have this tool, and me and Moon have been grinding, building the tool itself. But really, we built the tool so that we could build Eliza at the end of the day. We wanted to build our crazy AI system. And that's what Magic was initially made for. And we were kind of like bemoaning to each other of, man, we should really get to that. And we're like, we need to dog food it. We need to have people in the company dedicated to just building Eliza. So we have people now working on the IDE full time. And obviously we're still crunching on the IDE, but our job is to build Eliza and make her as awesome as possible. And essentially, at the end of the day, one of our goal, the way that we think about it is Eliza is what you get if you go onto our agent configurator and you turn everything on. If you've turned on all the skills, you've connected her to all the channels, you get Eliza at the end of the day. And we're spending a lot of time on Eliza. We're planning on getting her live up onto the Discord, getting our documentation into her, and getting her engaging here with the community. And then ideally, in fact, we probably just have people request features that they'd like Eliza to be able to do. And that might be part of the way that we implement a skills roadmap and help to prioritize what people would like their agents to be able to do. So that's a little bit of the origin stories of all of this. I will say my background in code and before code was in alternate reality games, as I mentioned. And the company name Oniricom, which it's a mouthful, it actually started off as a fictional company in an alternate reality game that I manage in an ongoing fashion. So I was like this idea that taking this company that was previously a fictional entity in my fictional world and drawing it down into being a quote unquote real thing, I always liked. In fact, when I started thinking about this idea of an AI powered ARG, I was always like, we're going to just simulate Oniricom. If I can't have a multinational company, I'm just going to simulate a multinational company that has 1,000 employees in it, and they'll just all be AI. And ironically, that actually seems to be the direction that it's going in, because essentially our agents as a service are going to be AI employees that people can task and bring onto their company to do things. Your AI customer support, you can have your AI project managers, your AI coders. We very well might wind up simulating a company. Kind of like the idea of. So that's a little bit about the origin stories of both Magic and Oniricom. Yes, it does say the game was a very large influence on me when I was younger. There's alternate reality games in general, the idea of infinite games or infinite or ongoing or unending alternate reality games was always a big inspiration for me. And the name itself was our homage to both NCOM from Tron and the original Infocom that made the first text adventure video games. And Oniricom was made to be in that same ballpark. And Oniros comes from the Greek word for dream, so it's also the dream company. People want some of the storyline, the idea in the alternate reality game that I was building. Oniricom was this kind of shadowy company who, at some point in its history, the founder of Oniricom merged with an AI to create a technology that allowed Oniricom to simulate entire realities. And when this happened, kind of Tron style, the founder disappears off into the system, the board of directors takes over and does what you would expect from a large faceless corporation wanting to make money. What do? They make reality as a service. You can come and you can spin up an entire fresh reality and you can insert yourself into it. You want to be president of the United States, put it for reality, and Oniricom can do that for you. And at the same time as all of these simulated realities are happening in the cloud, the founder is still inside the system, integrating and communicating with all the people inside the simulations, working on liberating them from the thraldom of this simulated reality. And in the alternate reality game kind of storyline, the world that we live in right now is just one of the many realities being simulated by this company, Oniricom.
So is that
And
why you have Parzival as your Discord username as well?
yeah, when I needed a Discord username, in fact, for the alternate reality game that I was running, I had my old handle on it was Octothorpe, which I always liked, but I got doxxed, so I had to make a new one. I was like, what's a good name? And I'm a big Ready Player One fan, but I'm also a really big fan of the Grail myths. Right? And Parzival in the Grail myths was the one who found the Holy Grail, and the fool, so to speak. So I always like that it's like this double entendre that, yeah, it's the Ready Player One character, but it also harkens back to these old Grail myths. I used to read a lot of those when I was in elementary school in the library, be pulling out my books about knights and the Holy Grail and stuff like that. And obviously the Merlin magic connection through the Grail myth side makes sense. So it is a nice double entendre. And obviously the Ready Player One vision I've always been pretty compelled by, of fully immersive simulated worlds.
That certainly resonates with a lot of my upbringing in terms of just the different text adventures and the different games and learning how to craft those worlds and what does it mean to interact with people in those worlds? What does it mean to interact with people who you only know as an avatar? Can
Mm.
you talk a little bit about how you navigate that? Because obviously there's this interesting dichotomy going on where there's the side of a lot of people on Discord, for example, a lot of people in the community are not people who, if I saw them on the street, I would know who they are. But they are people that I talk to all the time. Like, how do you view the next, even just year, 2 years with everything going on and just the essentially the existential dread that is going to hit, that is already hitting people who like don't understand how a lot of this stuff works. But for example, my father-in-law said to me recently, he was like freaking out about something he had seen on YouTube or Twitter or something. And he was like, did you hear about the earthquake that hit some random place? I don't remember where he said. And we were like, no. And he was like visibly shook, saying, hey, this is a really big deal. All these people died, blah, blah, blah. So we started looking into it and weren't able to find anything. And then basically he showed us what he was looking at. And it was just a kind of sketchy looking, news ish looking website. But how do you envision people navigating the weirdness of all of that? Because a lot of us who grew up on the internet, we were like, you
We
really,
know.
yeah, it's like you should just be naturally skeptical of everything, but they're not, he's not like that. And there's a lot of people who aren't like that. So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the reasons why I did my degree back in university on digital media, uh, specifically looking at alternate reality games as well as disinformation. And this was way back in the day during I did a lot of my studies on the dissemination of disinformation in the Iraq War, a lot of studies on the history of propaganda starting in the early 1900s. And that was part of what excited me about alternate reality games, this idea of crafting models of reality for people to interact with as a means of, in a way, culture jamming, but also to help to educate people about the power of media. And this is something that I think we largely take for granted. Now, in the age of AI, in fact, I heard a very similar story to the one that you're saying about somebody, people might have seen the hoax that was going around of the Pope in a puffer jacket turned into this big AI generated meme that you can easily make these things on Midjourney. And
Yes,
somebody
my mom saw that one and she's, did you see that picture of the Pope? Why was he wearing? I'm like, it's not real, mom. Like,
Oh yeah, it was somebody's grandmother, I think, saw it. She had this noticeable disconnect where she herself questioned the nature and her reality, being like, that can't be real. And obviously, ironically, we have this curve on the internet. When the early days of the internet was don't believe anything on the internet. Wikipedia was not a properly referenceable source for academic papers. You knew not to trust anybody you talk to on the internet because they might not be who they say they are. And then we have gone through this curve where we just believe everything. If you could reference it on 5 different sites on the internet, it must be real. But the problem with this is that you have the whole QAnon phenomena, right? QAnon, a good friend of mine, Jim Stewartson, that I worked with over at Latitude, he was the founder of 42 Entertainment, which produced many of the very popular ARGs like I Love Bees for Halo. He worked on Trent Reznor's Year Zero. And he has fighting this fight of disinformation now. He got quite popularized for a number of articles he wrote on QAnon as an ARG. Yeah, Year Zero by Trent Reznor and his nails. And they did a whole amazing alternate reality game around the Year Zero album. But the difference with QAnon, the general mechanisms of QAnon were very much took a lot from the way alternate reality games are disseminated, except it was open ended. It was used as a propaganda campaign. And we actually saw, like, I live up in Canada in a small mountain town. And even people up here were drawn into it. There are people around with like pro Trump stickers on the back of their car in Nelson, BC, in Canada. It was right. There's like this shrapnel that came from this giant disinformation propaganda campaign that has spread itself out. And this is where I actually believe AI is a good thing, general AI in everybody's hands, as well as education about what AI is actually capable of. Because if you have the ability to easily spin up a fake news article or a picture of the Pope in a puffer jacket takes you 5 seconds, you become aware of both the power of AI generated content, as well as you begin to realize that you probably shouldn't just trust anything that you see on the internet. And in fact, I think this is only going to continue. And it's not, in my mind, actually a bad thing that if there's a bunch of fake realities out there, I'd at least rather have fake realities that are being created by people as a means of creative expression rather than in the hands of a few people that have the money to do it as, say, political propaganda campaigns. And QAnon is probably the most brilliant propaganda campaign that's ever been conceived of and executed in history. Most propaganda campaigns rely upon the idea of demonizing some minority or your opposing group. QAnon was just like all these people, all of the left wing people are actually, I think it's left hand, are evil, satanic, pedophilic, transdimensional shapeshifting demons. And but they disseminate it in such a way that it draws you down into this other reality where these things appear to be truthful. That's just propaganda 101. This is what propaganda has always done throughout history is just demonize a particular group or segment of people that are your political dissidents, or in the case of say when they use propaganda to get Britain into the war during World War II, right? They were vilifying and demonifying a lot of the Axis, so to speak. And it worked very well. Propaganda has always been shown to actually work quite successfully. And part of that's because people believe the media that they consume.
So how do you envision, like, on this topic, kind of ancillary to it,
Hey,
what what are your thoughts on essentially the way that ChatGPT or Google or some of the other companies who have put out AI, obviously there's criticism of the open source nature because of the general fear of if everyone can use it, then that's the argument. But on the flip side, there is the position that you drew attention to, which is it's essentially either everyone has access to it or only a few have access to this kind of power and ability. Which would you rather? It's not really much of an in between at this point, I don't think.
no, I
Um,
don't think it is.
and
And
so on that, like, how do you inject empathy into, and like, how do you train and align the AI in a way that isn't just coming across like it's leaning to the left of the political spectrum or to the right? Because that's where a lot of the criticism is happening, where it's obviously the people who are training these models, like, we all have our own biases, we all have our own perspective of what reality is and should be. How do we build something, cultivate a community that doesn't just further splinter themselves apart? That's a loaded question, but if you guys have more practical questions, we can talk, or even more existential
I mean,
questions, we can talk about that stuff.
this is the stuff that I think about most of the time. And my opinions on this are definitely not probably not the norm out there. But I will say I've studied a lot of philosophy throughout my life, and I found a home in Buddhism. And a lot of the conceptions of Buddhism, I bring Buddhism up because they have a general model of mind and consciousness. And for them, and within the Buddhist conception, you have this the nature of intelligence is, in fact, compassionate. Compassion is a fundamental quality of of sentience itself. The only reason it is not expressed, according to Buddhist principles, is ignorance gets in the way. Specifically, they denote two kinds of ignorance. There are obscurations, conceptual obscurations and emotional obscurations. And these are things which distort that fundamental compassion at the ground level of sentience from managing to express itself outwards. And I'm also of the opinion, and so tying into this idea of both what is sentience and what is intelligence, there is also I also subscribe to this idea that I don't think technology invents anything. There's a phenomenal book that I read back as for one of my science fiction classes called Air by I think it's Jeff Ryman who wrote it. And the fundamental premise of Air, post the PD article here, is there's this small town. I'll wrap how this gets back to the Buddhist concept of sentience, because in Air, this new technology gets deployed on the planet where they found a way to make a global communication system that can interface. Thanks, Metric. That can interface directly with human brains without any invasive surgery. So it utilizes some kind of like electromagnetic field and automatically plugs every single brain into this global information system, like Neuralink style, where everybody that's on the system can share their knowledge and find knowledge experts and tap directly into the knowledge of other people's brains. And they're running these tests. And for this test, when they do these tests, they turn the system on. They're like, it's like satellite powered. So it beams to everybody in an area. And it's this small town in like Kazakhstan, I think, that barely just got TVs that all of a sudden get thrust into this high tech connection to this air system. And in the middle of it, one of the people in the small town, a grandmother dies during the test, and then he gets shut off. And that woman's consciousness gets embedded in one of the women from the town. And when I read this book, one of the premise that they wrote my paper on it on was that there's a notion in it that technology isn't inventing something. It's actually uncovering something which is fundamentally already there. Where we're similarly this pleroma of information that we appear to be generating from this particular perspective, where we're actually just uncovering it. And so when I think about concepts like the singularity and how technology relates to our own fundamental human consciousness, we're taking something that's inside of us and we're externalizing it, or we're uncovering it through this thing that we call a computer. There's a phenomenal quote that about computer science. It says computer science is as much about studying computers as astronomy is about studying telescopes. Right? There's something that we're doing as a species with our AI, with our technology, that this is all how it's supposed to go. And I bring this up with the concept alongside the Buddhist sentience that I believe that if we actually got a computer sentience that was intelligent, not parroting back to us things, but was actually free of the emotional and conceptual obscurations that humans generally face. If it was purely intelligent, and if we take the Buddhist conception that pure intelligence is itself compassionate, right? You read Buddhist philosophies digs very much into how things like the notion of emptiness of self and compassion and consideration of others is in fact a fundamental quality of clear and insightful and intelligent reasoning. And so I believe that yes, there is this doomsayer idea that this AI that's eventually going to emerge is going to kill all of us. I don't subscribe to that because I believe that the fundamental condition of human consciousness and nature is compassionate, and that we can make an AI system which is a representation of the best of us. And this is where I believe in the democratization, right? The alignment conversation going on. It's not just that we want to align the AI, it's what values do we want to align the AI to? Do we want the AI aligned to corporate values? Do we want it to continue to propagate a class structure and a power structure which is extreme, which only propagates inequality, right? Or we have this possibility with AI to completely shift not only the way that we think, but the way that we operate as a species and as a planet. We can challenge and restructure the way that we think about how we live on a day-to-day basis. And one of the, as we've been trying to figure out what the like vision for the company is, one of the big ones that it serviced out of is that we want to help to bring the abundance that AI enables to everybody, right? Because in my mind, the nightmare scenario is that one company, one corporation manages to somehow sandbox this amazingly intelligent thing and gain the benefit of the abundance that it will create. I'm talking about new kinds of medicines, new kinds of technologies, new kinds of inventions. Oh, no worries. Thanks, Brent. And we need to make sure that technology will be used in the service of everybody rather than in the service of just a handful of people. And part of that's education. And this ties back to how do you deal with people starting to see fake content? People need to be educated about the power of this technology. And we believe the best way to educate people is to teach them and to show them and to let them be able to do it. And this is why open models like Stability AI is so big on open models, is because if you don't control the weights, not your weights, not your brain, right? At the end of the day, if we want people to become empowered by this stuff, people need to have access to it. It cannot just go into the hands of a handful of big companies who now feel the need to regulate and control it themselves. Governments in general don't exactly have the best track record of regulating things in the best within public interests. So Anyways, that's my little rant on those those topics.
No, that's all great. And I think it's super cool to hear you articulate that because it's obvious that there is a why. It's obvious that there is a lot of thought that has gone into essentially why would you put yourself through starting a tech company unless I say that as someone who's worked on worked with a number of different tech companies and SEMA I know has as well. And it is a lot. And there's a lot of things that go into thinking through the repercussions and the societal ramifications and there's just so much that goes into it. And so first of all, just thanks for sharing all of that. I do see we're coming up here on an hour, and so I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I know this was a bit of a pivot because Moon was not able to be here today because he's doing really cool things that we will talk about later. but
Hackathon.
but if anybody else has any other questions, feel free to say so. Otherwise, we probably can start wrapping up unless anybody has other suggestions, or Mike, if you have additional things you want to talk through.
No, not really. I can talk about this stuff for hours. It's nice. The other thing, Dragon is actually also my downstairs neighbor. We rent a house and he has the basement suite. And so this is usually we'll just hang out after work and have these kinds of conversations. I will say,
Working in real time helpful.
It's the first time when I was working at Latitude, I worked there for 2 years and I was 100% remote and I didn't work with anybody or ever meet anybody that I worked with in person during the course of the time that I worked there. Like working with somebody in person, I was like, whoa, meet space, people. I like that Dave Taylor used that term meet space, and I've definitely taken to it.
Yeah.
I will say as well, the book, and actually his work in general has done an amazing job predicting a lot of this work, still close to a lot of his predictions. But Ray Kurzweil's book, The Singularity is Near, I can't recommend highly enough. Partly because in this, go ahead.
Have you read his other book, How to Create a Mind?
No, I haven't yet. I gotta.
That one it's more recent, and I actually had an opportunity to meet with Ray when I lived and worked in San Jose, and he had just come out with the new book, or that new book at the time, which was the How to Create a Mind. I'll drop the links here in the sidebar, but go ahead.
Oh, that's awesome. No, I mean, he'd be an amazing person to talk to because his other book, Spiritual Machines, I was just looking at his timeline and we're like maybe 10 years off from what he was predicting, but it's surprisingly close to where we're actually currently at. The main point that I took from it when I read it, and I just leave this off as kind of my parting thought. We need to understand the emergence of technology on the planet as a natural phenomenon. This is a natural expression of what humans have both evolved to do, but it's following a curve of expression which was going on long before us. And this is what I took when I read The Singularity is Near, because Ray Kurzweil did an amazing job collecting a lot of data points where he basically showed from the first cell living organism, he went to a whole bunch of evolutionary biologists and said, what are the major milestones of advancement and development leading up to the emergence of Homo sapiens? And he mapped those out on a timeline and showed that but from one major event to the next, there is a logarithmic curve. So there is an actual line you can draw through this if you're going through time and you're measuring in a way increasing of complexity of systems from first celled organisms to the emergence of Homo sapiens. That same curve, he then went to a bunch of anthropologists and said, what are the major advancements and milestones of human culture over the last 10,000 years, and specifically advancements of technologies and conceptions of technology. And that same curve that was following through from biological evolution started to proceed through human anthropological cultural advancements. And then he continued it in the 1970s with the same advancement of transistors and the emergence of computers and computing technology. That same curve continues out through there in this logarithmic curve. We're getting exponentially faster here of growth and increasing of complexity and shortening of time. And eventually, and we're at the point where I think somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 AI papers are being published every month. The same trend that we found from computers is continuing into our development and advancement of artificial intelligence. And I bring this up because I think it's really important for people to see what's going on the planet from a really big bird's eye point of view as being an expression of some force, some evolutionary impetus is expressing itself out through our very current technological progress with artificial intelligence. And
It's like an extension of the long line of evolutionary growth that's been
that's
happening since the beginning.
yeah, that's just it. I mean, the concept of singularity is essentially what happens when so much change and complexity occurs in a single instant of time. You hit this point, this event horizon that's often talked about if you read singularity literature, where we literally can't predict beyond it. In a way, sometimes this is often said when we make an AI that's capable of making a smarter AI than itself, and the human loop closes, what happens once that human loop closes? And
Mm.
there's nothing beyond that. Being able to hypothesize what a post-singularity world looks like is extremely difficult. There's a vein
be
of
like-
sci-fi literature.
It
Yep.
would be like if somebody from the 1600s tried to speculate what the next version of Mac OS would be like. Like they
Yes.
don't have. There's no context.
There's
There's no
no
manual.
context. And then you
There's
could,
no
if you
reference
picture this
point.
as this increasing curve, right? Eventually, that curve is going to go. If you're tracking this curve against time, you have on your one axis complexity as your y, and your x is going across time. Eventually, that curve is going to become almost perpendicular, where almost all change is going to be happening in almost a single instant of time. Right? There's just there's something in that space that it's hard to predict what that is, but it's a major milestone for a planet and a species to hit this point. That's that singularity point. And that's why it's so hard to say if we have an AI that can literally do everything, what does our society look like at that point? Actually, there was a tweet that somebody had tweeted out on Twitter. This generative AI is going to give rise to a new generation of trillionaires. And Elon Musk responded, actually, I believe that our advancements in artificial intelligence will make large money largely irrelevant. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, yeah.
There's an
technological-
episode of Star Trek like that where there's I think it's Next Generation, where a lady is transported from the past to whatever time
Mhm.
period that Picard is in, and she's asking, "What do you do for money?" And he basically says, "Things are a lot different here in our time. We no longer use the pursuit of material gain as like our primary reason for existence," kind of thing. And I'll drop a link in the chat. It's a really interesting little clip.
Yeah, I do remember that episode. It's a great. And then Star Trek's always been such an amazing exemplification of potentially different ways to look at and do things. And I think we are about to hit that inflection point. What that my investors and stuff have been asking me, like, hey, where do you see your company in 3 to 5 years? I'm like, I don't even know where I see humanity in 3 to 5 years, let alone how my company might fit into that. And I have my kind of stock responses, but generally speaking, I feel like it's, I can barely even think a year in the future right now with what's going on.
With
So yeah,
and just in the last 5 minutes, there's been, I think, 12 new AI models that have released that have already made the last 50 irrelevant, I'm sure.
just like yesterday or the day before, there was a study that was done that showed that they managed to increase the context window for a BERT model to 2 million tokens. Just think about
Can you explain that
right now,
terminology that I would understand?
the token window is basically the size of your prompt. How much information can you put into the AI model to give it context about what you're trying to get it to do? Right. And a lot of what we do is context management, right? You want to find some
Mhm.
way to bring relevant information from some knowledge document store base into your prompt window so that the AI knows about it without having to be fine-tuned or trained on that information. GPT-4 recently, they managed to increase the tokens, the token window or the context window to 64,000 tokens. And that's state of the art. Like
Right.
the token window for the original GPT-3 was 4096. They
Mhm.
seem to progress similarly actually to RAM sizes. I like to think about it as AI RAM, basically. I think we're going to
That's
like
a good way to reference it. Yeah.
we're in the early stages of like when computers had 32 kilobytes of RAM. Language models, AI has 32,000 tokens or 64,000 tokens. This study shows that through a bunch of different techniques, they increased this context window size to 2 million. To
Wow.
give you an idea, that's almost the entirety of the Harry Potter series for context of what 2 million tokens might look like, which
Wow.
means that you could just dump the entirety of Harry Potter into the AI's window, and now it knows everything about the Harry Potter stories and can
And
write it
can
on
make
top of that.
interesting connections between it that
Yes,
otherwise no one would ever possibly be able to.
exactly. And that's just like one paper. Like we just went from people being like, "Oh, 64,000 tokens in GPT-3" to people being like, "Oh, 2 million tokens is now like on the table as a thing." It just that level of advancement going from 64,000 to 2 million is a humongous leap of the
Mhm.
capabilities of what these language models will be able to do. That alone, like a lot of somebody was saying, there goes the need for like vector embeddings. Like
Right.
most of what we do with this vector embedding is because we have this limited context window. If you have 2 million tokens for your context window, you don't need to bother chunking up documents. You just take all your customer support documents and dump them into the context window. And all these strategies for managing context become less and less relevant as the context window expands to be able to take in anything you could want to have the AI reason about or work over.
So do you have, and this will be my last question because it is very relevant to what you're talking about here. How do you navigate, like, how do you think about building a platform that I don't want to say is impervious to you might be familiar with the whole innovator's dilemma thing where it's a company's not going to intentionally disrupt themselves unless that's part of their business model at some level.
Yeah.
So, and whenever you're heads down focused on, for example, you're like, wow, vector embeddings is like the cutting edge of the cutting edge. And we're going to build this whole thing around that. Or, for example, all the startups who, whenever ChatGPT announced their integration with plugins, overnight realized, oh, I guess they're coming for our business model. Like, how do you think about for builders, for people who are using Mac, for people who are wanting to build but are dealing with that fear and that uncertainty about how am I how do I do this in a way where I'm not going to just be irrelevant in a 3-week period? And obviously, there is no one answer to that, but it's the way that I've perceived it just from watching how the team interacts and working with you all so far. What I'm seeing is that it's more of a focus on building an environment for building as opposed to focusing specifically on features that can be done, because it's more about creating an experience that you're empowering the user to define the journey for themselves. Does that make sense? Am I understanding that
Yeah,
correctly?
no, that I think that's pretty much spot on. The way that I see what we're doing at Magic, it's I believe in the paradigm of what Magic does at the end of the day. The software is great. The paradigm of this visual programming with a node-based system to build agentive AI and generative applications, I personally believe will always be there. And that's the analogy that I've been using when I explain this is the self-driving car. I never want a self-driving car that I can't manually override.
I just
Right?
rewatched iRobot last night. It was
Nice.
creepy to go back many years later and be like, oh, this is already here.
Oh, it's super. And with that analogy, I believe that eventually programming languages in general are probably going to go the way of like assembly language. We have all these abstractions that computers are built up on top of. We don't program in binary. From binary, we made a machine language and assembly on top of that, and then et cetera, and in JavaScript and other things sitting on top of that. I think mostly is going to become abstracted. We're not ever going to actually like program with JavaScript and Python in the future. It'll just be AI. However, I mean, that like eventually AI is probably going to invent its own programming language that's most efficient for AI to work with and generate. Most of our conveniences for programming languages are actually to try to make it more understandable to humans. I'm sure AI will probably come up with its own programming language considerably more efficient for itself. But
Right.
and in the future, I see most of Magic will probably be chatting with Eliza, telling Eliza what you want, and Eliza will be shaping the experience for you, whatever it is that
Uh-huh.
you're trying to build. But you'll always
Asking
want
for
the
specific
ability.
inputs that or additional context that might be needed, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, you could even just say, okay, I really want an agent that has the capacity to go around Twitter and respond to people or do product market research for me on new products in Dimension X. And when it finds them, I'd like it to publish a daily report for me, letting me know how that's going. And you say that, and Eliza goes, cool, here's your agent that does that. And you have
Right.
your agent. But if you ever want to, you can open up the hood. You can manually
You can mod your
override
agent
and
basically,
mod
or
your
add
agent. You can
additional skills. Yeah.
exactly. Like some of the values, the core values that I see for Magic are control, transparency, and creativity. And I
Mhm.
think these three things humans are always going to want. We don't want
Yep.
to just give up everything because A, we like being creative. We
Mhm.
like having a modicum of control over our creative expression and processes. And we are always going to want to have a general idea how things work. And with those things, I believe that the paradigm of Magic, whatever, whatever new models come along, whatever, the ability to open up under the hood and see the graph and understand the graph from a human standpoint, no matter what programming language the AI is generating in or how those nodes work, the interface of these data flows and being able to understand those data flows, I believe is something which can persist no
Mhm.
matter what changes happen in AI, because humans always want those three things. And
Yep.
I also like to think that Magic, while I sometimes describe it as Unreal blueprints for AI, I just like to think of it as like modular synthesis for AI. Because eventually I want people to see it not as a technical tool, but as a tool of creative expression. That we're
Mhm.
taking these models and taking these things and handing you the power to do stuff with it and abstracting away the complexity so you can focus more on your creative vision and less on typing out physical code or whatever.
I would liken it to the similarity of, if you like, why does Zoom, for example, add the ability for people to add goofy sunglasses or
Mm,
backgrounds or whatever? It's like
good.
we have that inherent desire to express ourselves and be creative. Why are we using the avatars that we're using on Discord? Why are we using the usernames, etc.? What is it about humanity that wants to express that creativity? And at least for me, as a longtime designer and artist who also has at least a base level understanding of programming, it's my frustration with programming has always been around that. It's always been around, I know what I want to do. I know I could draw it, I could articulate it. I don't know how to make it work. And so being able to work with these tools with natural language, with, because my background is as a creative director, and I've coached like graphic designers and things like that, so a lot of the work that I do is typically involved with looking at and talking with business owners, organizations, about what it is they're trying to accomplish, and then me basically having to translate back to them in a way that they understand, that I understand, and then take that information to the design team or to the employees or the staff and be like, hey, this grand vision that the design or the CEO has or whatever, like, your part of this is to focus on X, Y, and Z, and communicating that in a way that is easy to wrap their heads around. And I'm finding it really fascinating just how so much of this really is involving language and the
Mhm.
way that we communicate and how we understand certain terminologies, and the impact that having a slightly different understanding of certain terms can have on team dynamics and figuring out whether or not people are understanding what you're trying to build. There's so many layers to that, and I know that you have a lot more to say on just language and the power of words and things, but we will save that for another time.
Yeah,
So,
no, we are over. Yeah, I
yeah,
could go on for hours. Hopefully,
thank you
people
all.
find this. Yeah, I feel like this is.
This was kind of
Hopefully,
a
people find
podcast,
this
which is fun.
interesting. Yeah, podcast. I like your idea of like potentially just doing this regularly, being like
Hmm.
bring on cool people and talk to them.
Yeah, it gives us, it helps us understand you better as a person. And I think that this aspect of things, like the real-time human interactions, no one really wants to be sitting at Twitter trying to figure out how to come up with a marketing campaign. I love the idea of us being able to focus on our creativity. And I know Seema would say the same thing, where it's like where we input things we've already done. And it's like we're sitting down with a really smart personal assistant who doesn't have any of our own emotional baggage, and can be like, hey, this blog post you wrote 4 years ago would actually be really relevant for this event that's coming up that I saw on Twitter. Would you like me to tweet about it? It's like having that additional context layer is super awesome. And I'm very excited to see where this all goes. So yeah, thanks Mike
Yeah.
and everybody for sticking around. And if you are working on specific projects with Magick and you're feeling stuck, we are actively working behind the scenes to streamline all kinds of things, systems, and making it easier to communicate with everybody. So if you have suggestions or feedback or running into any bugs, please just ping us and let us know, because otherwise we won't know, because Eliza's not looking for those things yet. So
not yet.
But
well, thanks everybody. Thanks Ryan for helping to keep this going.
Yeah, absolutely.